My daughter invited me to an elegant dinner at her house, but when I arrived, I was stopped at the door. "You should be ashamed to wear those poor man's clothes." Meanwhile, her in-laws laughed at me. Later that night, 34 missed calls. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. My name is Raymond, and I'm 64 years old. I never thought I'd be telling a story like this, but sometimes life forces you to face truths you've been avoiding for years. It was a Tuesday evening in October when Rose called. My daughter rarely contacted me unless she needed something, so hearing her voice on the phone immediately put me on edge. "Dad, I want to invite you to dinner at our house this Saturday," she said, her tone unusually formal. "Marcus and I are having his parents over, and I thought it would be nice for you to meet them properly." I felt a flutter of hope in my chest. Rose had been married to Marcus for 3 years, and I'd only met his parents briefly at the wedding. They seemed like decent people, though I could tell they came from money. Marcus was a successful attorney, and his parents owned several businesses around town. "That sounds wonderful, honey," I replied, trying not to sound too eager. "What time should I be there?" 7 o'clock sharp. "And Dad, please dress nicely, okay? This is important to me." I spent the rest of the week looking forward to Saturday. Maybe this was Rose's way of trying to bridge the gap that had grown between us over the years. Maybe she was finally ready to include me in her new life. Saturday arrived, and I put on my best outfit, a navy blue suit I'd bought 5 years ago for Rose's college graduation. It wasn't expensive, but it was clean and pressed. I even polished my old leather shoes until they gleamed. Looking in the mirror, I thought I looked respectable enough for a family dinner. Rose and Marcus lived in Willowbrook Estates, one of those gated communities where every house looked like it belonged in a magazine. Their colonial-style home sat on a perfectly manicured lawn with a circular driveway and elaborate landscaping. Every time I visited, I felt like I was entering a different world. I parked my 12-year-old Honda Civic behind Marcus's BMW and walked up to the front door, carrying a bouquet of flowers I'd picked up at the grocery store. Through the large windows, I could see elegant figures moving around inside. Marcus's parents had already arrived. I rang the doorbell and waited, adjusting my tie nervously. When the door opened, Rose appeared, wearing a stunning black dress that probably cost more than I made in a month. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. She looked beautiful, but there was something cold in her eyes that made my stomach clench. "Dad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her gaze swept over me from head to toe, and I watched her expression change from neutral to something resembling horror. "Hi, sweetheart." "You look beautiful," I said, extending the flowers toward her. "These are for you." She didn't take them. Instead, she stepped closer to me, blocking the doorway with her body. Behind her, I could hear laughter and conversation from the dining room. "Dad, what are you wearing?" Her voice was sharp, cutting. I looked down at myself, confused. "My suit. The one I wore to your graduation. I thought..." "You thought wrong." She glanced over her shoulder, then back at me. "You can't come in dressed like that. You should be ashamed of yourself showing up to a dinner party looking like some kind of homeless person." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my face flush with embarrassment and confusion. "Rose, I don't understand. This is my best suit." "Your best suit looks like it came from a thrift store," she hissed, stepping out onto the porch and pulling the door partially closed behind her. "Marcus's parents are successful business owners. His father owns 3 car dealerships. His mother sits on the board of the country club. And you show up looking like you can't even afford decent clothes." From inside the house, I heard a voice call out, "Rose, darling, who's at the door?" "Nobody important," Rose called back without taking her eyes off me. "Just someone selling something." I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. This was my daughter, the little girl I'd raised alone after her mother died. The girl I'd worked 2 jobs to put through college. The girl I'd sacrificed everything for. "Rose, please," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I'm your father. These people are going to be your family now. Can't we just..." "No." Her voice was final, absolute. "I won't let you embarrass me in front of Marcus's parents. I've worked too hard to build this life, to have you ruin it by showing up looking like you just crawled out of some rundown apartment." The irony wasn't lost on me. I did live in a rundown apartment, a 1-bedroom place in the older part of town, where the rent was affordable on my Social Security and the small pension from my years working at the factory. But Rose knew why I lived there. She knew about the sacrifices I'd made. Behind Rose, I caught a glimpse of Marcus approaching the door. He was wearing an expensive-looking suit, and even from a distance, I could see the confusion on his face. "Rose, what's going on?" he asked, reaching the door. "Mr. Patterson, hello. Please come in." Rose turned to her husband with a bright, fake smile. "Actually, honey, Dad just stopped by to drop off some flowers. He can't stay. He has other plans tonight." Marcus looked between us, clearly sensing the tension, but not understanding it. "Are you sure? We have plenty of food, and my parents would love to meet you properly." I opened my mouth to speak, to explain that I'd been invited, that I'd been looking forward to this dinner all week. But the look in Rose's eyes stopped me. It was pure panic mixed with something else. Shame. She was ashamed of me. "That's very kind of you, Marcus," I managed to say, my voice hoarse. "But Rose is right. I have other commitments tonight." Rose snatched the flowers from my hands without even looking at them. "Thanks for stopping by, Dad. I'll call you later." Before I could say another word, she stepped back inside and closed the door. I stood there on the porch for a long moment, staring at the beautiful mahogany door with its brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. Through the windows, I could see the warm glow of the dining room, could hear the sound of laughter and conversation. I walked back to my car on unsteady legs, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. As I drove away from Willowbrook Estates, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror of Rose's house, all lit up and welcoming to everyone except her own father. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and stop signs. I kept replaying Rose's words in my head, the way she'd looked at me like I was something dirty she needed to hide. By the time I reached my apartment building, tears were streaming down my face. I sat in my car in the parking lot for nearly an hour, trying to understand what had just happened. How had my relationship with my daughter deteriorated to this point? When had I become someone she was ashamed to be seen with? The worst part wasn't even the humiliation, though that burned like acid in my chest. The worst part was the realization that this wasn't sudden. This had been building for years, and I'd been too blind or too hopeful to see it. As I finally made my way up to my small apartment, one question kept echoing in my mind. What kind of man raises a daughter who becomes so ashamed of him that she'd rather lie to her husband than let him sit at her dinner table? I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Rose's face, the disgust, the shame, the way she'd looked at me like I was a stranger she wanted to disappear. So I did what I always did when the present became too painful. I retreated into the past. Sitting in my small kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, I pulled out the photo album I kept in the drawer. The pages were worn from years of handling, the pictures faded, but still clear enough to transport me back to a time when Rose looked at me like I was her hero instead of her embarrassment. The first photo showed Rose at 5 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, sitting on my shoulders at the county fair. We'd gone on every ride she was tall enough for, and I'd won her a stuffed elephant by throwing rings at milk bottles. She'd insisted on carrying that elephant everywhere for months, even to the grocery store and the laundromat. That was just 2 years after Linda died. My wife had been 31 when the cancer took her, and Rose was only 3. Those early years were the hardest of my life, trying to be both mother and father to a little girl who kept asking when Mommy was coming home. I turned the page and found the picture that always made my chest tight. Rose at 7, standing in front of our old house on Maple Street. It wasn't much, a small 2-bedroom ranch with peeling paint and a leaky roof, but it was ours. Rose is holding a first day of school sign, wearing a bright pink dress that Linda's sister had sent for her birthday. I remembered that morning so clearly. I'd been working the night shift at Patterson Manufacturing, the textile factory where I'd worked for 23 years. I'd gotten home at 7 in the morning, just in time to make Rose breakfast and walk her to school. My eyes were burning from exhaustion, my hands stained with machine oil that never seemed to wash completely clean. But Rose didn't care. She held my hand tight and chattered about all the things she hoped to learn. "Do you think my teacher will like me, Daddy?" she'd asked. looking up at me with those big brown eyes that were so much like her mother's. "Baby girl, how could anyone not like you?" I'd replied, and I'd meant every word. The next picture showed Rose at 10, standing beside her bike, a pink Schwinn I'd bought her for Christmas. What the photo didn't show was how I'd worked double shifts for 3 months to afford that bike, or how I'd stayed up until 2 in the morning on Christmas Eve, putting it together, because I couldn't afford to pay the store to assemble it. Rose had wanted that bike so badly. All her friends had bikes, and she felt left out, walking everywhere while they rode around the neighborhood. When she saw it Christmas morning, she'd thrown her arms around my neck and told me I was the best daddy in the whole world. I traced my finger over the photo, remembering how proud she'd looked, learning to ride it in our small backyard, how patient I'd been running alongside her, holding the seat steady until she was ready to go on her own. The photographs continued through the years, documenting a childhood that was simple but filled with love. Rose at her middle school graduation, wearing a dress I'd bought on clearance and altered myself. Rose at 14, helping me paint our kitchen during one of my weeks of vacation from the factory. Rose at 16, getting ready for prom in a dress that had cost me 2 weeks' worth of grocery money, but seeing her face light up when she looked in the mirror had made every sacrifice worth it. But it was the pictures from her high school years that started to tell a different story. I could see the change in her expression, the way she'd started to pull away from me. By the time she was 15, she'd stopped wanting me to walk her to school events. She'd make excuses about why I couldn't attend her games or concerts. She said I smelled like the factory, that the other parents would think I was weird. I told myself it was normal teenage behavior. All kids went through phases where they were embarrassed by their parents. But looking back now, I could see that, for Rose, it wasn't a phase. It was the beginning of a permanent shift in how she saw me. The most painful photo was from her high school graduation. Rose is standing between me and her guidance counselor, Mrs. Henderson. Rose is smiling, but it's forced. She'd asked Mrs. Henderson to stand with us for the family photo because she said it would look better. At the time, I thought she was just being polite, including a teacher who'd helped her. Now I realized she was trying to make our little family of 2 look more respectable. After high school, Rose had gotten a partial scholarship to the state university. Partial. That word had terrified me because I knew what it meant. I'd have to find a way to pay for the rest. The scholarship covered about 60% of her tuition and fees. I'd need to come up with nearly $15,000 a year for 4 years. I worked out the math on a piece of scrap paper one night after Rose had gone to bed. With my factory wages and the small amount Linda had left in a savings account, there was no way I could afford it. Not unless I made some drastic changes. So I sold our house. The house on Maple Street wasn't worth much, but in 2006, before the housing market crashed, I was able to get $45,000 for it. After paying off the remaining mortgage, I had about $30,000 left, enough to cover 2 years of Rose's college expenses if I was careful. I moved us into a small apartment across town and took on a second job cleaning office buildings at night. My days became a blur of factory work from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, a few hours of sleep, then cleaning offices from 11 at night until 6 in the morning. I existed on coffee and determination, fueled by the vision of Rose walking across that graduation stage with her college diploma. Rose hated the apartment. It was smaller than our house, and the neighborhood wasn't as nice. She complained constantly about the thin walls, the lack of a backyard, the way the elevator sometimes broke down. But what choice did I have? It was either the apartment or no college. "Why can't you just get a better job?" she'd asked me one day during her sophomore year. She was home for spring break, and I could see the way she looked around our small living space with disappointment. "Baby, this is the best job I can get without a college education," I'd tried to explain. "That's why it's so important for you to get your degree, so you'll have choices I never had." But she didn't want to hear it. By then, she'd started spending more time with her college friends during breaks, staying at their houses instead of coming home. When she did come home, she'd complain about how embarrassing it was to tell people where she lived. The final 2 years of college nearly broke me. The apartment rent kept going up, and my arthritis was getting worse from all the physical labor. Some mornings, I could barely grip my coffee cup because my hands were so stiff and swollen. But I never let Rose see how much I was struggling. I didn't want her to worry or feel guilty about the cost of her education. When she graduated with her degree in business administration, I was so proud I cried during the ceremony. She'd done it. My little girl had achieved something I'd never been able to do. She had a college degree and a bright future ahead of her. But even at graduation, I could sense her pulling away. She introduced me to her friends as just my dad, never elaborating about our relationship or our family. When her friends talked about their parents' jobs or their homes, Rose would change the subject quickly. A year after graduation, she met Marcus at her first job. He was 3 years older, already established in his law practice, and came from the kind of family Rose had always dreamed of being part of. When she brought him to meet me for the first time, I could see the way she looked around our small apartment with fresh eyes, seeing it the way she imagined Marcus saw it. The visit was awkward and brief. Marcus was polite enough, but I could tell he was struggling to understand how Rose had come from such humble circumstances. After they left, I found myself looking around the apartment the same way Rose had, seeing the worn furniture, the outdated appliances, the water stain on the ceiling that I'd never been able to afford to fix properly. Now, sitting in that same apartment at 2 a.m, surrounded by photographs that documented a lifetime of love and sacrifice, I finally understood what had happened. Somewhere along the way, Rose had decided that her past, our past, was something to be ashamed of instead of something to be proud of. She'd forgotten that every opportunity she'd had, every door that had opened for her, had been paid for with my sweat and sleepless nights. She'd forgotten that the reason she could marry into Marcus's world was because I'd given up everything to make sure she had the education and confidence to belong there. But I hadn't forgotten. And as I closed the photo album and finally headed to bed as the sun began to rise, I realized that maybe it was time Rose remembered too. The week after the dinner incident passed in a haze of hurt and confusion, I kept replaying that evening over and over, trying to understand how things had gone so wrong between Rose and me. I'd raised her to be better than this, hadn't I? Where had I failed as a father? It was the following Sunday when everything changed. I was sitting on my small balcony, drinking my morning coffee and watching the birds at the feeder I'd hung outside my window, when my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, knocked on my door. Midi Dadas. Chen was in her 70s, a sweet woman who'd lived in the apartment next to mine for the past 6 years. She was one of the few bright spots in this building, always friendly, always asking about Rose when she saw me in the hallway. "Raymond, dear, do you have a minute?" she asked when I opened the door. Her expression was troubled, and she was wringing her hands in that way people do when they have bad news to deliver. "Of course, Mrs. Chen. Come in. Would you like some coffee?" She shook her head and remained standing by the door as if she might need to make a quick escape. "I need to tell you something, and I'm not sure how to say it." A cold dread settled in my stomach. "What is it?" "It's about Rose, about things she's been saying." Mrs. Chen's voice was barely above a whisper. "My daughter Lucy knows Rose from that book club they both joined at the community center downtown. You know, the one for young professional women." I nodded, though I hadn't known Rose was in any book club. She rarely shared details about her social life with me anymore. "Well, Lucy came to visit me yesterday, and she mentioned something that, well, it doesn't sound like the Rose you've always told me about." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Chen took a deep breath. "Lucy said Rose has been telling everyone in the book club that she grew up with her wealthy grandparents after her father abandoned her when she was young. She's been saying that you disappeared from her life when she was 7 years old, and that she was raised by your parents, who supposedly owned a successful business." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I actually took a step backward, gripping the doorframe for support. That's not true. None of that is true." "I know, dear. I've seen you with Rose over the years. I've heard you talk about working extra shifts to pay for her college, about how proud you were when she graduated. But according to Lucy, Rose tells people that her father was irresponsible and selfish, that he chose his own interests over his daughter." I felt like I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to be spinning around me. She said I abandoned her? Mrs. Chen nodded sadly. And that's not all. Lucy said Rose claims she put herself through college with help from these rich grandparents, and that she learned her work ethic and values from them, not from you. She apparently tells people that you only came back into her life recently, trying to take credit for her success. I sank into my armchair, my legs suddenly unable to support me. My parents had died when Rose was 5 years old. They'd been wonderful people, but they'd been farmers who'd lived paycheck to paycheck their entire lives. The idea that Rose was claiming they'd been wealthy and had raised her was so absurd, it would have been funny if it weren't so devastating. "There's more," Mrs. Chen said gently, sitting down across from me. Lucy said Rose showed the book club pictures of a house she claimed to have grown up in. It wasn't your old house on Maple Street. It was some mansion she'd found online. The betrayal cut deeper than I thought possible. It wasn't just that Rose was ashamed of me. She'd completely rewritten our history. She'd erased every sacrifice I'd made, every sleepless night I'd worked to give her opportunities, every moment of love and care I'd poured into raising her. "Why would she do this?" I asked, though I wasn't really expecting Mrs. Chen to have an answer. "I think," Mrs. Chen said carefully, "that she's trying to fit into a world where having a working-class father doesn't match the image she wants to project. It's easier to invent rich grandparents than to explain why her father lives in a small apartment and drives an old car." After Mrs. Chen left, I sat in my apartment for hours, staring at the wall. Everything made sense now. Rose's behavior at the dinner, her embarrassment about my appearance, the way she'd treated me like a stranger at her door. She hadn't just been ashamed of me in that moment. She'd been living a lie for months, maybe years. I thought about all the times she'd visited Marcus's family, all the social events they'd attended together. Had she been spinning these stories the entire time? Had Marcus heard these lies about me? Did he think I was some deadbeat father who'd abandoned my daughter? The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. I almost didn't answer it, but when I saw it was my old friend Charlie from the factory, I picked up. "Ray, you old dog, how are you doing?" Charlie's voice was cheerful, but it quickly turned concerned when he heard my tone. "I've been better, Charlie. Actually, I could use some advice." I told him everything, the dinner incident, Mrs. Chen's revelation, all of it. Charlie listened without interrupting, making small sounds of sympathy and outrage at appropriate moments. "Jesus, Ray," he said when I finished. "That's rough. But you know what? This explains a lot." "What do you mean?" "Remember last year when my nephew got married? The reception was at that fancy country club in Willowbrook. I saw Rose there with her husband, and I went over to say hello, to ask about you." My heart sank. What did she say? She acted like she barely knew me. When I mentioned that we'd worked together for 20 years, she just kind of smiled and changed the subject. But then her husband asked how I knew her, and she said something about me being someone from the old neighborhood who knew her family from way back. "He didn't mention that you were my friend?" "Not directly." And when I started to tell him about how proud you were of her college graduation, about all the overtime you worked to pay for it, she quickly steered the conversation away. I thought it was weird at the time, but now it made perfect sense. Rose had been carefully managing her narrative for a long time, making sure that the truth about our relationship never came to light. I spent the rest of the day in a strange state of clarity. The hurt was still there, sharp and constant, but underneath it was something else, a cold anger that I hadn't felt in years. Not anger at Rose's success or her new life, but anger at the betrayal, at the way she'd taken my love and sacrifice and turned it into something shameful. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I drove past Rose's house in Willowbrook Estates. I didn't stop or get out of the car. I just sat at the end of her street and looked at the beautiful home that my years of factory work and night shifts had helped make possible. The house was lit up warmly from within, and I could see shadows moving around inside. Rose's life looked perfect from the outside. The expensive cars in the driveway, the manicured lawn, the impressive architecture. But I knew now that it was all built on a foundation of lies. As I drove home, I made a decision. I'd spent years protecting Rose, putting her needs before my own, sacrificing my comfort for her opportunities. I'd never asked for gratitude or recognition, but I'd also never expected to be completely erased from her story. The Rose I'd raised would never have done this. The little girl who had held my hand on her first day of school, who'd cried when I was sick with the flu because she was afraid something would happen to me, who'd once told me I was her hero. That girl was gone. In her place was a woman who was so desperate to belong to a world that valued money over character that she'd rather invent dead grandparents than acknowledge the living father who'd given her everything. But lies have a way of catching up with people, and I had a feeling that Rose's carefully constructed story was about to come crashing down around her. The question was, when it did, would she finally remember who had really been there for her all along? Or had she buried that truth so deeply that even she had started to believe her own lies? I was about to find out. The reckoning came sooner than I expected. It was a Thursday afternoon, 3 days after my conversation with Mrs. Chen. I was at the grocery store carefully comparing prices on canned soup, a habit that came from years of stretching every dollar, when my phone started ringing. Rose. I stared at her name on the screen for a moment, then declined the call. I wasn't ready to talk to her yet. I needed more time to process everything I'd learned, to figure out what I wanted to say. The phone rang again, immediately. Rose. I declined it again and continued shopping. But as I made my way through the store, the phone kept ringing. Rose, Rose, Rose. By the time I reached the checkout line, she'd called 7 times. Something was wrong. Rose never called me repeatedly like this. In fact, she rarely called me at all anymore. Our communication had dwindled to maybe once a month, usually brief conversations about her work or my health. I paid for my groceries and walked out to my car, the phone still buzzing in my pocket. As I loaded the bags into my trunk, I noticed I had several voicemail notifications. Against my better judgment, I played the first one. "Dad, please call me back. It's important. We need to talk." Rose's voice was shaky, almost panicked. The second message was more desperate. "Dad, please, I know you're getting these. Just call me back, please." By the third message, she was crying, "Daddy, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Everything is falling apart and I don't know what to do. Please call me back." Daddy. She hadn't called me that in over 10 years. I drove home with my phone buzzing constantly on the passenger seat. By the time I reached my apartment building, Rose had called 21 times. 21. I sat in my car for a few minutes, watching the missed call notifications pile up on my screen. Part of me wanted to answer, to find out what emergency could possibly warrant this kind of desperation. But a larger part of me, the part that was still raw from learning about her lies, wanted to let her stew in whatever mess she'd created. I carried my groceries upstairs and put them away, the phone continuing to ring every few minutes. I made myself a sandwich and sat at my kitchen table staring at the device like it was a bomb waiting to explode. Call 26 came as I was finishing my lunch. This time I answered. "What's wrong, Rose?" "Oh God, Dad, thank God you answered." She was sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. "Everything is ruined. Everything." "Slow down. What happened?" Marcus found out. About everything. About the lies I told about you, about growing up with Grandma and Grandpa, about all of it. I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest, followed immediately by shame for feeling that way. How did he find out? His mother. Rose's voice was thick with tears and snot. She hired a private investigator to do a background check on our family before the wedding. She never told us about it, but she kept the report. Today, she finally read it thoroughly because she's planning some big charity event and wanted to invite our extended family. A private investigator, of course. Marcus's family had enough money to conduct that kind of research, and enough sense to want to know exactly who their son was marrying. The report had everything in it, Dad. Your employment history, our old address on Maple Street, Mom's death certificate, Grandma and Grandpa's real financial records, showing they were farmers who died with almost nothing. Everything. Rose dissolved into fresh sobs. I waited for her to continue, not trusting myself to speak yet. Marcus's mother confronted me this morning. She had the whole report printed out, highlighted in yellow marker. She said she'd been wondering why I never talked about my grandparents in detail, why there were no photos of them in our house. She said she knew something was off about my story, but she'd hoped she was wrong. What did you tell her? I tried to explain, but it just made everything worse. She said I'd been lying to her family for 3 years, that I'd deceived Marcus into marrying me under false pretenses. She said she couldn't trust anything about me anymore. I closed my eyes, imagining the scene. Marcus's mother was a sharp woman. I'd sensed that even in our brief meeting at the wedding. She wouldn't take kindly to being lied to, especially about something this fundamental. Where's Marcus now? He left. He just left. He said he didn't know who I really was anymore, that our entire relationship was built on lies. His mother told him that if he stayed married to me, he'd be cut off from the family trust fund. The family trust fund. Of course, that's what this was really about, money and social position. Marcus's family wasn't just wealthy. They were generationally wealthy, the kind of people who measured worth in bloodlines and bank accounts. Dad, I'm going to lose everything. The house, my social connections, my standing in the community. Marcus is talking about annulment instead of divorce because he says our marriage was based on fraud. Fraud. The word hung in the air between us. In a way, it was accurate. Rose had defrauded Marcus and his family. But more than that, she'd defrauded herself and me. She'd traded our real story, one of love, sacrifice, and resilience, for a fake one that sounded more impressive at dinner parties. I don't know what to do, Rose continued, her voice breaking. I've ruined everything. My marriage, my reputation, everything I worked so hard to build. Everything you worked hard to build? The words came out sharper than I intended. Or everything I worked hard to give you. Silence. Rose, do you remember who paid for your college education? Do you remember who sold his house and worked 2 jobs so you could have opportunities I never had? Dad, Do you remember the night shifts I worked cleaning office buildings, the overtime at the factory, the years I went without buying new clothes or taking vacations because every spare dollar went toward your future? I remember, she whispered. Then why? My voice cracked with the weight of months of hurt and confusion. Why would you erase all of that? Why would you turn our story into something shameful? Rose was quiet for so long I thought she might have hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and broken. Because I was ashamed, okay? I was ashamed of where I came from. I was ashamed of our little apartment and your factory clothes and the way you smelled like machine oil, even after you showered. I wanted to fit in with Marcus's world, and I thought if I could just reinvent my past, nobody would ever know. The honesty was brutal, but it was also a relief. Finally, the truth. You were ashamed of me, I said. It wasn't a question. Yes, the word was barely audible. And I hate myself for it. I know what you sacrificed for me. I know how much you loved me, how hard you worked. But I was so desperate to belong to something bigger, something better, that I convinced myself our real story wasn't good enough. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the photo album I'd left open from a few nights ago. There was 8-year-old Rose, grinning at the camera after winning her first spelling bee. I remembered how proud she'd been, how she'd insisted on wearing her winner's ribbon to bed that night. What do you want from me, Rose? I want you to forgive me. I want you to help me figure out how to fix this mess. Her voice trailed off. You want what? I want to go back to being your little girl again, back to when things were simple and real, and I knew who I was. But that was impossible, and we both knew it. You can't unknow the things you know or unfeel the things you felt. Rose had shown me exactly how she saw me, and I'd seen exactly who she'd become. I'm sorry, Rose. I'm sorry your lies caught up with you, and I'm sorry your marriage is falling apart, but I can't fix this for you. You created this mess by being ashamed of who we really are. You'll have to find your own way out. Dad, please. I hung up. The phone immediately started ringing again. I turned it off and sat in the gathering darkness of my small apartment, surrounded by the photos and memories of a daughter who'd once looked at me like I hung the moon. By the time I turned my phone back on the next morning, Rose had called 34 times. 34 desperate attempts to drag me back into a life where I was useful to her again. But I was done being useful. I was done being the father who sacrificed everything and asked for nothing in return. I was done being erased from my own daughter's story. Rose would have to face the consequences of her choices alone. Just like I'd been alone all those years while she was building her new life on the foundation of lies about mine. For 3 weeks after hanging up on Rose, I managed to maintain my silence. The calls continued for the first few days, sometimes 5 or 6 times a day, but gradually they tapered off. The voicemails became less frantic and more resigned. I deleted them all without listening. I was learning to live with a strange, new emotion, indifference toward my own daughter. It wasn't the burning anger I'd felt when I first discovered her lies, nor was it the crushing hurt that had consumed me after the dinner incident. It was something colder and more final, the kind of emotional distance that comes when you finally accept that someone you love has become someone you don't recognize. I developed a routine that didn't include Rose: grocery shopping on Tuesdays, laundry on Saturdays, coffee with Charlie and some of the other retired factory workers on Thursday mornings at the diner downtown. I was sleeping better than I had in months, no longer carrying the constant anxiety of wondering when Rose would call and what she might need from me. Then, on a rainy Wednesday evening in late November, she showed up at my door. I was watching the news when I heard the knock. Through the peephole, I could see Rose standing in the hallway, soaked from the rain. She looked terrible. Her hair was stringy and unwashed, her expensive clothes wrinkled like she'd been sleeping in them. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she'd lost weight. This wasn't the polished, put-together woman who'd been too ashamed to let me into her dinner party. This was someone who'd been broken down to her core. I almost didn't open the door, almost. But something in her posture, the way she was hunched over, shivering in the cold hallway, reminded me of the little girl she used to be. Against my better judgment, I turned the deadbolt. "Hello, Rose." "Dad," her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside without a word. She walked into my small living room and stood there, dripping on the carpet, looking around like she was seeing the place for the first time. Maybe, in a way, she was. Maybe she'd never really looked at where and how I lived. "You look like hell," I said, closing the door behind her. "I feel like hell." She wrapped her arms around herself, still shivering. "Marcus filed for annulment last week. It's official now. We're over." "I'm sorry to hear that." She looked at me sharply, searching my face for sarcasm. When she didn't find any, her shoulders sagged. "Are you? Really? I'm sorry that you're hurting. I never wanted that for you, even after everything that's happened." Rose sank onto my old couch without being invited. Water from her wet coat soaked into the fabric, but I didn't say anything. She looked around the apartment again, taking in the worn furniture, the small television, the stack of library books on my coffee table. "I never really looked at this place before," she said quietly. "I mean, I came here, but I never really saw it." What do you see now?" She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving from the photos on my bookshelf to the simple meals I had planned out on my kitchen counter for the week. "I see a man who's been living alone for a long time. A man who reads library books because he can't afford to buy new ones. A man who clips coupons and plans his meals carefully because every dollar matters." I sat down in my armchair across from her. And I see a father who sacrificed everything for a daughter who threw it all away because she was ashamed of his love. The words hung between us like a confession. I'd been waiting for this moment, for Rose to finally understand what she'd done, what she'd destroyed. But now that it was here, I felt surprisingly empty. "Why did you come here tonight, Rose?" She reached into her purse and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. "I wrote you a letter. I've been carrying it around for 2 weeks, trying to work up the courage to give it to you." I didn't take it. "Why don't you just tell me what it says?" Rose unfolded the paper with shaking hands. Her voice was barely audible as she began to read. "Dear Dad, I don't know how to start this letter because I don't know how to apologize for erasing someone from their own story. That's what I did to you. I took your love, your sacrifice, your years of working yourself to exhaustion for me, and I made it disappear because it didn't fit the image I wanted to project." She paused, wiping her nose with her sleeve. The gesture was so childlike, it hurt to watch. I told myself I was protecting you by not talking about your struggles, by not mentioning how hard you worked. But that wasn't true. I was protecting myself from being associated with anything that Marcus's family might see as beneath them. I was protecting the lie I'd built about who I was and where I came from. Rose looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. I know now that the real story, our real story, is so much better than the fake one I invented. A father who loved his daughter enough to sell his house, work 2 jobs, sacrifice his own comfort and security so she could have opportunities he never had. That's not shameful. That's heroic. But you didn't think so at the time. No, she admitted, I didn't. I was so focused on fitting into Marcus's world that I forgot the world you built for me was already perfect. Not perfect because it was easy or comfortable, but perfect because it was real. And it was ours. I stared at my daughter, this broken, desperate woman who used to be the center of my universe. What do you want from me, Rose? I want to know if there's any way back from this. I want to know if you can ever forgive me for what I did. Not for Marcus or his family or any of that, but for you. For us. The question I'd been dreading, the one I'd been asking myself for weeks. Do you know what the worst part was? I asked her. It wasn't the lies you told about me. It wasn't even the way you treated me at your dinner party. The worst part was realizing that you saw my love as something to be ashamed of instead of something to be proud of. Rose flinched like I'd slapped her. I worked those extra shifts not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I wanted to give you every opportunity I never had. I wanted you to have choices and freedom and the chance to become whoever you wanted to be. And you did become someone. You became someone who was embarrassed by the very love that made your success possible. I know, she whispered. I know I did that, and I'll never forgive myself for it. The question isn't whether you can forgive yourself, Rose. The question is whether I can trust you again, whether I can believe that you won't wake up tomorrow and decide that having a working-class father is still something to be ashamed of. Rose slid off the couch and onto her knees in front of my chair. The gesture was so dramatic it made me uncomfortable, but I could see the desperation in her eyes. I lost everything, Dad. My marriage, my house, my social circle, my reputation. Marcus's family made sure everyone in our social group knows exactly what I did. I'm a pariah now. But you know what the strangest thing is? What? I feel relieved. For the first time in years, I don't have to pretend to be someone I'm not. I don't have to worry about hiding my past or making up stories about rich grandparents. I can just be me again, your daughter. I looked down at this woman kneeling on my worn carpet, and for a moment I saw flashes of the little girl she used to be. The girl who used to curl up in my lap when she had nightmares. The girl who used to make me Father's Day cards with pictures of us holding hands. But I also saw the woman who'd stood at her front door and told me I should be ashamed of my clothes. The woman who'd invented an entire fictional family history, rather than acknowledge the real father who'd given her everything. Get up, Rose. Get up and sit down. She climbed back onto the couch, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. I need you to understand something, I said. Even if I forgive you, and I'm not saying I will, things can't go back to the way they were. You can't unsay the things you said or undo the choices you made. You can't unknow how little you thought of me and the life we built together. I know. Do you? Because this isn't some storybook where we hug and cry and everything goes back to normal. You damaged something fundamental between us, Rose. You took the most sacred thing I had, my love for my daughter, and you made it into something dirty and shameful. Rose was sobbing now, her whole body shaking with the force of her grief. Please, Dad, please don't give up on me. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm begging you. I need you. I need my father. I sat there watching my daughter fall apart on my couch, and I realized something that surprised me. The anger was gone. The hurt was still there, deep and persistent, but the rage that had sustained me for weeks had burned itself out. What remained was exhaustion and a profound sadness for what we'd lost. I need time, Rose. I need time to figure out if this is real or if you're just desperate because your other options have dried up. He nodded frantically. Whatever you need, however long it takes. And I need you to understand that even if we find a way forward, it won't be the same relationship we had before. I won't be the father who gives everything and asks for nothing. I won't be the person you turn to only when you need something. I understand. Do you? Because I'm not sure you do. I think you're used to me being available whenever you decide you want me around. That stops now." Rose wiped her face and looked at me with something I hadn't seen in years: respect. "What can I do?" she asked. "How can I prove to you that I'm serious about making this right?" I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the rain falling on the parking lot of my modest apartment complex. This was my world. Small, simple, honest. For the first time in months, I wasn't ashamed of it. "You can start by figuring out who you are when you're not trying to be someone else," I said without turning around. "You can figure out what kind of person you want to be when nobody's watching or judging or keeping score." When I turned back to face her, Rose was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Will you give me a chance to show you?" I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw someone I'd never seen before. Not the confident socialite who'd been too good for her blue-collar father, and not the desperate woman who'd just lost everything. I saw someone who was finally, maybe for the first time in years, being completely honest. "We'll see," I said. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I meant it. 6 months later, I was sitting in my usual spot at Murphy's Diner, sharing coffee and conversation with Charlie and 2 other guys from the old factory crew, when Rose walked in. She looked different. Not just thinner, though she'd lost more weight since that rainy night in my apartment, but different in a way that was harder to define. Her clothes were simpler, more practical. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail instead of the elaborate style she used to favor. She moved with less certainty, less of that aggressive confidence that had defined her during her years as Marcus's wife. She spotted me immediately and walked over to our table with hesitant steps. "Hi, Dad." "Hello, Rose." I gestured to an empty chair. "Sit down. I'll introduce you to the guys." The surprise on her face was obvious. She'd expected me to be uncomfortable about her meeting my friends, to maybe make excuses about who she was or why she was there. Instead, I introduced her simply and proudly. "This is my daughter, Rose. Rose, these are my friends Charlie, Bill, and Frank. We all worked together at Patterson Manufacturing for 20-plus years." Charlie, bless him, stood up and shook her hand warmly. "Rose, I remember you from when you were about yay high," he said, holding his hand at waist level. "Your dad used to carry pictures of you in his wallet and bore us all to death talking about how smart you were." Rose glanced at me, then back at Charlie. "He did? Oh, honey, you have no idea. Every school play, every report card, every little milestone. We heard about all of it. This man was so proud of you, he practically glowed." I watched Rose process this information, saw her realize that while she'd been busy hiding me from her social circle, I'd been proudly sharing her accomplishments with mine. "We should let you 2 catch up," Bill said, standing and putting on his coat. "Rose, it was real nice meeting you. You take care of this old man, you hear? He's one of the good ones." After they left, Rose and I sat in awkward silence for a few moments. The waitress came over and Rose ordered coffee. Black. I remembered when she used to drink fancy lattes with complicated names. "You look good," I said, and I meant it. Despite the weight loss and the obvious stress she'd been under, there was something healthier about her appearance, something more real. "I got a job," she said without preamble. "It's not much. I'm working as an office manager at a small accounting firm downtown. The pay is terrible compared to what I'm used to, but it's honest work." Or, "How do you like it?" "I like it more than I thought I would. My boss is a woman who built her business from nothing. She doesn't care about my past or my connections or any of that. She just cares that I show up on time and do good work." Rose stirred her coffee even though she hadn't added anything to it. "I'm living in a small apartment now. 1 bedroom in a complex about 10 minutes from here. It's not fancy, but it's mine. I'm paying for it with money I'm earning myself." I nodded, saying nothing. These updates felt like progress reports, like Rose was checking off boxes to prove she was becoming a person I could respect again. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about figuring out who I am when nobody's watching. And I think I'm still figuring that out, but I know who I don't want to be anymore." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion at the counter. A young mother with 2 small children was trying to pay for her meal, but her card was being declined. She was clearly embarrassed, digging through her purse for cash she probably didn't have, while her kids fidgeted and complained about being hungry. Without thinking, I stood up and walked over to the counter. "Let me get that," I told the cashier, pulling out my wallet. The woman started to protest, but I waved her off. "I've been there," I said simply. "Pay it forward when you can." When I returned to the table, Rose was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You do that often?" she asked. "Do what?" "Help strangers like that," I shrugged. "When I can. It's not like I have a lot of extra money, but sometimes you see someone who needs a hand." Rose was quiet for a long time, staring into her coffee cup. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I spent so many years trying to become someone worthy of Marcus's family that I forgot I already had a family. I forgot I already had someone to be proud of." "Rose, no, let me say this, please." She took a shaky breath. "I used to be embarrassed that you worked in a factory, that you lived in a small apartment, that you couldn't afford expensive things. But watching you just now, seeing how you treated that woman with such kindness and dignity, I realized something." She paused, wiping her eyes with a napkin. "Marcus's family has millions of dollars. They belong to exclusive clubs and throw elaborate parties and have their names on buildings. But in 3 years of being part of that family, I never once saw any of them do what you just did. I never saw them treat a struggling stranger with basic human kindness." I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. It was the first time I'd touched my daughter in months. The person I became when I was trying to fit into their world, or else that wasn't me. That was someone I invented because I thought being Raymond Patterson's daughter wasn't good enough. But it was good enough. It was everything. We sat there holding hands across the table while Rose cried quietly. The other diners paid us no attention, just a father and daughter having coffee together. "I know I can't undo what I did," Rose said eventually. "I know I can't take back the lies or the way I treated you. But I want you to know that I'm trying to become someone you can be proud of again." "Rose, listen to me." I squeezed her hand gently. "I was always proud of you. Even when you were ashamed of me, even when you were lying about our life together, I was still proud of you. That was never the problem." "Then what was the problem?" "The problem was that you weren't proud of yourself. You were so busy trying to be someone else that you forgot who you really were." Rose nodded, understanding passing across her face like sunlight breaking through clouds. We finished our coffee and walked out to the parking lot together. Rose's car was a modest sedan, nothing like the luxury vehicles she used to drive. But she seemed comfortable in it, like it actually belonged to her instead of being part of a costume she was wearing. "Dad, would you like to see my apartment sometime? I could cook dinner for you. Nothing fancy, just dinner." I studied her face, looking for any trace of the woman who'd been too ashamed to let me into her mansion. All I saw was my daughter, nervous but hopeful, offering to share her small world with me. "I'd like that," I said. 2 weeks later, I sat at Rose's small kitchen table, eating spaghetti with meat sauce, the first meal she'd ever cooked for me from scratch. The apartment was simple but clean, furnished with second-hand pieces that she'd chosen herself. There were no expensive decorations or status symbols, just books and a few plants, and a small collection of photos that included several pictures of us from when she was young. "This is good," I said, twirling pasta around my fork. "Don't sound so surprised," Rose laughed. "I've been learning to cook. Turns out, it's not that hard when you're not too proud to follow a recipe." After dinner, we sat on her small couch, drinking coffee and talking about her job, my routine, the book I was reading. Normal conversation between a father and daughter who were learning to know each other again. "I ran into Marcus's mother at the grocery store last week," Rose said during a lull in conversation. "Oh." She pretended not to see me at first, but then she came over and asked how I was doing. I think she expected me to be bitter or angry or begging to be taken back into the family. "What did you tell her?" Rose smiled, and for the first time in months, it reached her eyes. I told her I was doing well. I told her I'd learned that being rich and being wealthy are two different things, and that I'd finally figured out which one actually mattered. What did she say to that? Nothing. She just looked confused and walked away. We both laughed at that, and I realized something had shifted between us. The careful distance I'd maintained for months was dissolving, replaced by something that felt more solid and honest than what we'd had before. As I was getting ready to leave that evening, Rose stopped me at the door. "Dad, I need to tell you something." "What's that?" "I'm happy. For the first time in years, I'm actually happy. Not because I have everything I want, but because I finally know who I am. And who I am is your daughter." I looked at this woman who'd caused me so much pain and confusion, who'd nearly destroyed our relationship with her lies and shame, and I saw something that had been missing for years: peace. "I'm proud of you, Rose. Not because of your job or your apartment or any of that. I'm proud of you because you found your way back to yourself." Driving home that night, I realized that I'd found something I hadn't even known I was looking for: freedom. Not freedom from Rose, but freedom from the burden of carrying a relationship alone. For years, I'd been the only one fighting for our connection, the only one who valued what we had together. Now, finally, Rose was fighting too. The woman who'd once been too ashamed to let me into her dinner party had become someone who invited me into her life, not because she needed something from me, but because she wanted me there. And that made all the difference. I still lived in my small apartment. I still shopped with coupons and drove my old car and met my friends at the diner every Thursday. But I was no longer carrying the weight of my daughter's shame or my own doubt about whether I'd been a good father. I had been a good father. The proof wasn't in Rose's success or her marriage or her social status. The proof was in the fact that when everything else fell away, when all the lies and pretense were stripped away, she still knew how to find her way home.